of Amnesty, where not only do we have an amazing new Secretary General who is South African and African, but we also have a really amazing woman who is the chair of our international board, who is also an African, who is Kenyan. So I will introduce, and her name is Mwikali Muthiani. So I just wanted to take you through the program for today. In a minute, Mwikali is going to come up here, where she will say a few words about Kumi and really explain, what was it that, because she's actually Kumi's boss, so she was the part of the board members that appointed Kumi, and she'll talk a bit about why she felt, or they felt, that Kumi was the right fit for Amnesty at this point in time. And then we will have Kumi, who will give his remarks. And finally, our regional director for Southern Africa, Depros Muchena, will moderate questions from you all. And this, we're hoping to take questions for about 20 minutes. And then finally, there'll be a chance for one-on-one interviews with Kumi afterwards. For those who haven't already booked them, there'll be an opportunity for you to book those. So it gives me great pleasure now to invite Mwikali Muthiani, the chair of our international board, to come up here and say a few words about Kumi.
Thank you, Shanila, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I feel very honored on behalf of the International Board of Amnesty to introduce Kumi, or to announce his appointment as our Secretary General. And very pleased also to stand here on African ground to announce his appointment, given that this is his home country. And so it's really a great pleasure for me to announce Kumi is joining Amnesty, joined us, in fact, yesterday. And Kumi is no stranger to all of you. You know his story perhaps better than myself and many other people in Amnesty who are not South African based. We feel very happy to have him, knowing that he started his fight against injustice, looking back at an age of 15 years, when he was part of the team that led a revolt in his high school, and he was expelled. And we felt that he demonstrated courage and great drive for human rights. And that is one of the reasons we felt was, it goes into his character of courage. When we look at the world right at this point and see the kind of space where we are in terms of human rights, we want somebody who has courage of conviction. We are looking for somebody who has passion. We are looking for somebody who is driven, somebody who has taken human rights injustice personally. And we felt that Kumi definitely fits into that role. And so in a pool of over 200 applicants who are also quite qualified into this role, we picked Kumi. And I'm very pleased that he accepted our offer. And he starts the journey with us, and hope he can stay and really meet the kind of, help us look at how we can bring in a lot of changes in the kind of human rights abuses we are seeing globally. In December, we will be celebrating the Declaration of Human Rights since that when it was signed 70 years ago. And when we look around, sometimes we may see or think there's nothing much to celebrate. And that's why even Kumi coming on board is really important, because we know there's a lot that needs to be done. We know the space is shrinking and it continues to shrink. We realize that as a movement, we need to speak a little bit more boldly, and Kumi brings with himself a lot of networks. He's a relationship builder, and that is one key other quality we've seen in him. He's also a very experienced global leader. He led as executive director of Greenpeace. We all know a lot of his work and brought Greenpeace into the global space in a very powerful way. He's led and co-founded and is founded and co-chairing the Africa Rising, which is about justice and dignity in Africa. So he's not afraid at all to confront issues around human rights abuses. And so it really gives me great pleasure to invite Kumi now to address you and to welcome him to Amnesty International. And Kumi, I truly look forward to working with you. And I know, and truly I know this, that what we saw in you, and knowing the space where we are at, within the organization and globally, you truly come and take us to the next level and to help us really fight the injustices that are there in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Makwali. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for making time to be here. I'm really pleased that this event is happening at the Nelson Mandela Foundation for two reasons. One, because Madiba touched my life and many of our lives so deeply as a young activist. And when I first heard Madiba's name, we didn't know how he looked because they banned his photograph. Some of you might remember, if it was ever printed, it had to be blocked out. But the bigger reason I'm so pleased is that when folks at Amnesty were encouraging me to be a candidate for this position, I had spoken to various people, and I'm one of the patrons of Future South Africa that was fighting the corruption and so on. And on Saturday morning, we were having a meeting in the boardroom. And I got here early, and before people arrived, I opened my computer, catching up on email before the meeting started, and there were 5 emails. All of them were from Amnesty, various people from Amnesty about, are you going to apply? The deadline is coming. And then I kind of put my hands on my head like this, thinking, oh my God, pressure, pressure, pressure. And then I turned to the left, I saw a portrait of Madiba, and I turned forward, and I saw a letter that Madiba wrote in 1962 to Amnesty International, thanking them for the support and solidarity. And I sort of thought, okay, the old man is speaking to me now. And so quite honestly, it was quite a spiritual moment for me. And I think that association gave me encouragement to take on what is a challenging role as the head of Amnesty International. I take on this role at a pretty challenging time for humanity, even though in December we will be 70 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sadly, far too many powerful leaders around the world have been moving the agenda of human rights backwards, especially in the last couple of years. We're talking here from Donald Trump, and just to pick one issue, the breaking up of families at the borders, of immigrant families, one of the worst atrocities we've seen in a long time. We see in the Philippines violence by the government of President Duterte. In Hungary, we see the shrinking of civil society space. We see the Saudi government brutalizing the people of Yemen, and the list is much, much longer. But even though this might be the case, I entered this role with optimism. And my optimism comes from the very fact that there's been such a setback in terms of a range of human rights that you are seeing new energies, new resistance, and a much more powerful mobilization against the slide back in human rights. And here we can look at young people and the role that they have been playing, because one of the visions that I have is to build a much more inclusive movement. And when we say we want to build an inclusive movement, we mean that we don't want anymore the idea that human rights is the responsibility of human rights organizations like Amnesty is not good enough. As Amnesty, we want to be able to work better in partnership with a range of organizations that are working on a day-to-day basis to advance human rights. In particular, we want to send a word to young people and youth leaders around the world that Amnesty wants to work with young people. We as Amnesty do not accept that young people are the leaders of tomorrow. We believe young people have to be the leaders of today. If they wait for tomorrow, with climate change, there might not be a tomorrow for them to exercise leadership. We want to send a special message today to the women's movement who have inspired activism against Trump through the Me Too movement and so on, that Amnesty wants to work much more closer with the women's movement globally. We also want to look at organizations and sectors that we have not worked as closely as we should have worked in the past, such as religious leaders. We believe that the religious leadership in the world might not agree on every single human rights value that an organization like Amnesty might put forward, but we agree on a substantial number of areas, and what we would like to see is the capability and maturity of all of us to be able to work around the issues that we agree on and to respectfully debate and continue to discuss areas where we have disagreements on. We would also say to the progressive business community that they have a responsibility to contribute to the fight on human rights, and we would be exploring that as well. Last but certainly not least, we really want to strengthen our relationship with the trade union movement. We have good relations, but we want to take it to a different level because we believe very strongly that labor rights are human rights and that we need to work with constituencies such as those. We also need to be much more bigger, right? Right now, Amnesty is impressive as a 7 million strong movement. For any of you who've tried to build membership movements, you'll know how difficult it is to build a membership of even 1,000. But to build a 7 million movement takes a lot of effort, and we want to expand that much, much more. Well, maybe I should, even though I've been told not to. You know, I want to dream of a 70 million movement. We want to be able to make this movement owned by people. And the most important message that I want to make in this opening remarks is that we do not want human rights to be seen as the preserve and the responsibility of a handful of human rights activists as such. We will only win when, in fact, human rights is more dispersed and taken up by a range of institutions where we have overlapping interests. So in terms of the bigger, we have to actually become much more inclusive, and one of the things I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessor, Salil Shetty, and others who were here, is to really strengthen our presence in the global south. And that is where we have some of the biggest human rights challenges, and we need to be stronger, and that is something that is already happening. The last part of the vision, so if you want, it's bigger, bolder, and more inclusive, and I want to speak to the bolder part. If history teaches us anything, humanity, whenever it is faced a major injustice or a major challenge, those challenges only were able to be addressed effectively when decent women and men stood up and said enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to put our lives on the line if necessary. And given the state of human rights in the world today, if ever there was a time that movements like Amnesty need to show maximum moral courage, it is now. And one of the things that I was very pleased when I addressed the Amnesty Annual General Meeting in Poland a few weeks ago, when I made the call for us to intensify civil disobedience, that was one of the things that was most well received. I want to conclude by saying that there's a quotation that has informed a lot of my thinking over the last couple of years from Martin Luther King, when basically he said, you know, we recognize in psychology there's a very dominant term called maladjusted, but he went on to say, you know, we don't want to be well adjusted to certain things in society that are unethical and unjust. And he says, we don't, you know, I refuse to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, and importantly, to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. While he was talking about the United States in the 60s, it is 1,000 times more relevant in the US today as it is 1,000 times relevant almost in every country around the world. But the point I'm making is we, even as the human rights movement, have to challenge ourselves about whether we have adapted to a range of things that we just shouldn't have adapted to. So I would like to come back to Madiba in concluding and leave you with two wisdoms which have really influenced my life. When Madiba once said, courage is not the absence of fear, but it is the triumphing or the overcoming of fear. I've done many actions for justice, even while I was at Greenpeace recently and so on. And I can tell you that I have moments of terrible fear. I mean, I was with Kyle there as part of Africans Rising in Cameroon, trying to document what was happening to the Anglophone-speaking parts, just 2 years ago. And I can tell you, every roadblock that we got stopped at 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning. Your heart, moves to a different part of the body in terms of panic, right? So it's not as if somebody like me who's been involved for a long time, since I was 15, doesn't feel fear, but it's about us recognizing that what we are fighting for is our children's future, and we need to summon greater courage. And the last quotation that I'll end with is Madiba saying, when you take on a big challenge, it always seems impossible until it is done. And yes, right now, sometimes when I think about bigger, bolder, more inclusive, more impactful amnesty, it doesn't sound impossible to me. It sounds like a big challenge. And I think it's a challenge working with the wonderful colleagues in more than 85 countries around the world, and with many partners and allies. I hope that that's a vision I can help Amnesty achieve. And I look forward to working with thousands of people around the world who already have inspired me in helping walk this journey together. Thank you very much for your presence here today.
Thank you, Kumi. Thanks, colleagues from the media. I think we should shoot straight into the program and invite you to ask questions. Please state your name and your organization, and then you can ask your question. We'll take 3 questions for the first round, and then we will see whether we can take more. We have about 20 minutes to do that. Thank you very much. Let's begin. Yes, Andy?
What do you think are the 3
Please just repeat your name. Okay, thank you, Andrew Brown. Second question. Yes, sir. Okay.
Journalists receive help from mainly European international institutions. It is like a court, sometimes you can't get help from the court, you don't have the source. It is something like this international institution also become like that if you are really privileged and you are getting a support from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we move the mic together? Can you just move the mic up? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Ntakwana Ngatani, SABC News. I'm just going to say names of countries and hopefully you can say something about them. Zimbabwe,
Right.
the DRC, the Middle East. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think Kumi will take those 3 and then we'll open the round again.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Firstly, on the 3, it's actually quite difficult because it depends how you slice the cake. If you take it geographically, then I would say right now, if you look at it geographically, I would say Syria, the Rohingya, or the Rakhine State issue in Burma, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So if I were to choose in a geographical sense. But listen, the list is much longer than that because of Yemen and what we are seeing happening there. we are seeing, and on our continent here, we have seen some positive signs, I must say. The changes in Gambia and the changes in Ethiopia. We don't want to overstate it, but there's been positive developments which we have been part of pushing for. But quite frankly, in many countries on the continent, we have seen far too many setbacks. But if we take it from an issues point of view, then I would say we have a complete failure of the global system to address in a humane and compassionate way the challenge of refugees and migration. Second issue, it's not a new issue, but it's been there for a long time, but at least now, through the activism mainly of women, it is now right at the center of public debate, and that is the issue of gender inequality generally, but specifically also violence against women and as well as children. The third issue for me that I would say content-wise is critical, and that is the issue of poverty and inequality, right? And that, because there are three generations of human rights. The first generation is focused on civil and political rights, freedom of association, assembly, and expression. The second is more on socio-economic rights. The third is on cultural, environmental rights, and so on. And what human rights theorists will say is that all of these are indivisible, and if one does not exist, they all fall apart. And part of what we are committed to as Amnesty is to ensure that all those areas are taken seriously. And I'm happy to say that at the recent annual general meeting of Amnesty, I now can say we have, rather than they have, we have embraced the need for Amnesty to contribute to the fight on climate change, because if the head of the trade union movement, Sharon Barrow, says, as a trade unionist, I say there are no jobs on a dead planet, and therefore I have to fight climate change. We in the human rights movement have to acknowledge there are no human beings on a dead planet, and therefore no human rights on a dead planet, so we have to be part of that fight as well. On the question of Tana, so just for the folks who are not from Turkey, about more than 1.5 million activists from within Amnesty helped give me the best welcome present yesterday into my job, because they were campaigning over the last 14 months for the release of the chair of the board of Amnesty Turkey, and he was released late last night on bail. And the question was, will we continue to fight for the 560 lawyers and other political prisoners other than lawyers as well? And our answer to that is absolutely. And you should know that we had already planned that we want to change the image of Amnesty in the sense that we are a truly global organization and we are everywhere. And so therefore, this is Amnesty base. We have a Southern Africa office, which is part of the global. And so from here, I'm headed to Turkey via East Africa in the next couple of days. So even though Tana has been released, I will still be proceeding to Turkey precisely to take up the issue of those that remain in prison. And then we as Amnesty are working with some of these other organizations. I don't know the depth of how we are working, but I hope that I will apply myself to ensuring that we have the best possible relationships with these organizations like the International Commission of Jurists and so on, so that when issues like what's happening in Turkey happens, we can come together quickly and act in a unified way. I love the way you asked the question now. Yeah, I think I'm draw on my assistance here of my colleagues. So I've said something about Middle East already in my earlier question, but just to say that I'm very pleased that now Amnesty has presence on the ground in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Tunis, and so on, and we're going to grow that. We have a Middle East and North Africa region, and we consider it a priority region. As you know, there are many, many challenges that are there. Zimbabwe, I'm going to ask for assistance from DEPROS to give a quick response. And on DRC, of course, We are following very closely the recent developments with regard to the elections and so on. And I should say that this is a high priority given the scale of how DRC fits into the African continent as a whole, and what happens in the DRC has impacts way beyond the DRC. Dipros, would you like to give a quick response to the question of Zimbabwe, and then you call for the second question?
Okay, thank you. Right, on Zimbabwe, of course, Amnesty International, like many other organizations and movements that are working actively in Zimbabwe, expected the election that just took place to be heralding a decisive break with the past of gross violations of human rights that were the citadel and rather canon on Robert Mugabe's governance. We also packaged a series of recommendations to political candidates and political parties before the election in a human rights manifesto launched inside the country to influence the debate that would inform both the electoral process but also candidate selection. And we continue to say, despite the impasse we see, a most important issue that we put forward is the ending of impunity. Zimbabwe continues to have a history of violence. And when violence takes place, there is no investigation that's undertaken. So more violence takes place. Just now, you know that there are 6 people who were killed in cold blood by the army when they had done absolutely nothing other than to participate in a protest. And of the 6 that were killed, there is no evidence linking any of those to any kind of protest action. Most of them were shot in the back. So we've called for a prompt and thorough investigation into the killings so that those who issued the orders are investigated and brought to justice, and those who carried that illegal order are also investigated and brought to justice. And then, of course, going forward, it's a whole human rights program that is needed in that country, which Amnesty International will be working with partners to make sure that whoever takes over as the president after the court action ensures that that human rights program is engaged on. And Kumi Naidoo's first action yesterday was to write a letter to whoever becomes president to investigate the case of Itai Dzamara, a pro-democracy activist who was disappeared on the 9th of March 2015 in a barber shop and has never been accounted for or is known where he is. And that, I think, has generated greater momentum inside the country that Amnesty International is picking up an issue which is symptomatic of a larger problem of enforced disappearance in the country. So we hope that that will continue to now mobilize more Zimbabweans to take action on the government and political parties. I think I'll end there. And then open up the second round of questions to Kumi. Yes, and again, continue to introduce yourself and your brief question.
Zinhle Nkosi from Power FM. Today marks 6 years after the Marikana massacre. I just wanted to get your opinion on human rights in the context of the Marikana massacre.
Thank you, Zinhle. Can I see anyone else? You want a second bite of the cherry? Yeah. SABC?
Yes. Okay, Ntakwana, SABC again. We've seen an increasing number of what people refer to as vigilante or mob justice. And that's as a result of what one maybe can call a failed criminal justice system, or even inequality, because it applies in some areas and not others. And where you see a lot of the mob justice is here in Johannesburg, for instance, in places like Diepsloot, where poorer people live. And so how would you, as Amnesty, approach an issue like this in South Africa? Because obviously, for people who are at the receiving end of mob justice, it's a human right violation. But for those who feel vindicated or who feel that this was done in their favor or to correct a wrong that was done to them, they feel it's warranted.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there a final one before we? Oh, okay, all right. So I'll invite Kumi to answer those two.
Thank you, Dipros. So I just want to answer that question in a bit of a personal way, if that's okay. The day Marikana happened, I was in the Russian Arctic. I was hanging off an oil rig doing a protest against, climate change and what's happening with expansion. And I missed the news completely. And I then eventually, when I got Wi-Fi access and the stories were coming through and I was seeing the images, to be honest, I thought this was like some bad joke, that in fact we, somebody was, making some false videos. So I think that it is a pathetic failure of our government that 6 years later that they have not addressed the question of decent reparations and accountability. So for us as Amnesty, we are focused primarily on the accountability side up to now, meaning that those that gave the orders, those that were responsible and so on need to be held accountable, because see, part of the problem that we have not only in this case but in many other cases is that we are institutionalizing a culture of impunity, meaning that people who violate believe that they can do it and get away with it. And every case that's left unprosecuted where there was a violation of human rights or an illegal act that led to murder and death and destruction, every case that doesn't get closed, we are allowing those that want to act with impunity to act with impunity. So that we stand very firmly on that. But also we think that it is a terrible statement that after 6 years, that no meaningful compensation has been offered to the families that were affected. And we, as Amnesty, hope that government will act with urgency and do the right thing. They've dragged the feet for far too long already. With regard to this very challenging question on vigilante and mob justice, so firstly, we think that it is the responsibility of governments to be able to ensure that the rule of law is applied, that there are people who are vulnerable, who are on the receiving end of crime, violence, or any other attacks, should feel the confidence that they can trust the authorities to go and bring a case and pursue it. And that's what we ideally want to see. We do not believe that vigilante or mob justice is, in fact, the more, a helpful response. Now, having said that, while we do not support it, personally, I would say I can understand why it happens because of the failure of government to provide the basic safety, minimum safety conditions that allows people to feel that they can pursue prosecution. So certainly we would not be, of course, advocating for, vigilante or mob justice, far from it. We can understand why it sometimes happens, and we would say the only way to prevent it and to ensure that due legal process is followed for governments not to continue to violate their responsibilities by ensuring that the rule of law is pursued, that there's a fairness in how the criminal justice system is applied, and that people who are survivors or victims of violence and injustice are not made doubly prosecuted. And, if you take the issues, like one of the areas where you see it happening quite a lot now in a few places around the country is related to violence against women and in particular, right? And, when we look at our policing system after so many years of activism, right? And if we ask ourselves in South Africa, is the policing system doing right by women by creating safe spaces for people to be able to go and report violence when they are on the receiving end of it and so on? I would say long, long way to go before we can say that we are anywhere near the kind of excellence that we need to be striving for to ensure that we are protecting those that are most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumi. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I think we come to the end of the press conference and the Q&A session. However, if there is anybody who wanted to have a one-on-one with Kumi, I think you should see Robert, who is standing with a mic over there with a blue jacket, and those who had already organized those in prior times, I think those will be taking place immediately after this. So thank you everyone for coming, and let's continue to work together. Again, for those who are based in South Africa, Shanila here is our National Director. Please do talk to her. And Netzanet Belai is our Africa Director for Research and Advocacy. If anybody wants to have discussions on the AU, ICC issues, he's our expert. Thank you very much. You can applaud if you want, yes.